Welcome back to another episode of the Resinator's Conquest podcast. This is all about the volley action when it comes to first blood. In order to take a volley action, the regiment in question would have to have the volley characteristic. In this case, the slingers for the Wadroon have the volley characteristic. And they're going to try to shoot at the Mori. After you know that the regiment has the volley characteristic, you have to check and see if they're in line of sight of the Mori. If there's at least one model that's within line of sight, they can take the volley action. And in this case, this guy's definitely within line of sight. Now, if you start looking at some of the other guys in the regiment, you'll see that this last guy, if you draw a straight line between where he is and the furthest out Mori, you'll see that he has to cross the foundry in order to shoot at that one, and therefore he actually cannot see. So when you're adding up shots, and we'll talk about that later, he will not contribute shots to that volley action. But the rest would. The rest of them are all within, line of sight of at least one of the Mori. After determining line of sight, you have to make sure that the acting regiment is within their barrage range of the target regiment. So in this case, the slingers have a 15-inch barrage range. If we measure these first two guys, they're definitely within the 15 inches. The middle guy, he's just barely within 15 inches. He's kind of like within 14 inches of these front guys. And then these last guys, they actually are not within the 15 inches. So when determining the number of shots, because these two slingers are not within range, they would not contribute shots when determining the number of shots when taking the volley action. One last thing about choosing your target, both the acting and the target regiment cannot be engaged in a melee fight. Therefore, if the Mori here were engaged with a Raptor Rider, let's say, and sorry for the paint job here, if the Mori were engaged with a Raptor Rider, then they could not be a target of a volley from the slingers here. Now the same would work if the slingers here were engaged with, let's say, the Bone Golem, then therefore they wouldn't be able to shoot at the Mori because they'd be engaged, kind of like having all their attention focused on the melee that they're engaged in. After we've chosen a target and determined that we're within the barrage range and in line of sight, then we're going to have to determine the number of shots that are going to be fired in the volley action. In this scenario, the slingers are definitely within their barrage range and they are within line of sight. So within 15 inches, they're within line of sight. Each one would contribute shots for the volley action. They have a barrage 2, so they would all contribute 2 dice to the pool when they are taking the volley action. We roll a total of 10 dice. Now we have another scenario where the distance between the two regiments are a little bit further. If we check, the first two here are definitely within their barrage range. They're within 12 inches. The middle guy, he's within about 14 inches of both these front guys. The last two guys are not within range of their barrage characteristic. Therefore, they would not contribute shots, neither one of them. So with the barrage of 2, the middle guy would contribute 2, and the 2 front guys would contribute 2, making a total of 6 dice that you'd roll for your volley. Now we're going to introduce a piece of terrain. This bottom slinger has definitely within line of sight. The middle slinger is definitely within line of sight of this guy here. But when it comes to this last slinger, he would have to go through the foundry in order to get to this Mori. So therefore he would not contribute shots. And it would only be 4 shots, because these 2 guys are out of range and this guy is just not within line of sight. After determining the number of shots, the last thing you'll have to do before rolling the dice, the last thing we have to check before rolling our dice is to make sure there's not a piece of terrain obscuring the line of sight for the acting regiment. In this case, I have a little kind of swamp piece of terrain here, and it's kind of directly in the path of the slingers shooting at the Mori. It's not blocking their line of sight, but it's actually obscuring their line of sight. And therefore, they would take a -1 penalty to their volley characteristic when rolling the dice. And we'll show you that in just a moment here. We're ready to roll some dice. We have 10 dice because all of the 5 slingers are within range of the Mori and line of sight. They have a barrage of 2, contributing 2 dice each. And so we're going to roll these 10 dice, and we have to compare it to the volley characteristic of the slingers, which is going to be 2. So in Conquest, we're always looking for lower. So in this case, we only had 2 shots. Okay? The Mori would then take their defense roll. The Mori would have a defense of 1, so we're rolling 2 dice to see if we get a 1. And we didn't get a 1 either one, so that would mean 2 wounds. That would mean one of my Mori would be dead. Volley actions do not cause morale tests, so you don't have to worry about doing a morale check at this point. You're all done with the volley action. We know that the slingers are within range of the Mori, and so they're going to contribute 10 dice during the volley action. Okay? But because there's a piece of obscuring terrain in between the acting regiment and the target regiment, the volley characteristic of the slingers would be -1. So now it's only 1. So now we roll our 10 dice, and we get the same, actually 3 hits this time. The Mori have a defense of 1, so we're rolling 3 dice, and that would be 3 wounds. So one would be dead, and this one would be wounded. That's the volley action. So one of the things I've really liked about the volley action when it came to First Blood, specifically with the slingers, and which is why I used them in my little demo scenarios, is that they have torrential fire. So every time they make a hit, they get to actually roll another dice to see if they get another hit. Those additional hits do not generate, further hits from then on. Let's use the scenario that we had earlier set up. We had 5 slingers contributing 10 shots. Now, the average on making a 2 is going to be, a third. So that would mean maybe you get 3 hits. That would mean that you could also roll 3 more dice and get potentially 3 more hits, which would then put you over 50% when it comes to, that's 60% actually when it comes to the die rolling success. Now, I like to have big regiments of the slingers. I usually bring them out in 8 or higher. And so they'll be rolling 16 dice a lot of times, and then, I usually get about 8 hits, and averaging around 8 hits, it seems like, and then rolling 8 more, end up getting like 15, 16 hits on an enemy regiment, and that's just my slingers. And so I really try to protect them as well, so I'll move them around and maneuver them so that they're like really in that far distance of 15 inches, so that they can't be charged. And I'll also protect them with having some melee regiments around them to engage another enemy regiment if they're coming too close. The only one kind of negative thing when it comes to volleys in First Blood is First Blood is played with a lot more terrain, and it's meant to be kind of fast acting. So a lot of times you'll be engaged, and that's the other thing about volley in the First Blood is that when they're engaged, you can't shoot at them. So that's a good tactic to actually use if you don't want a regiment to be shot at. Get them in engagement really quickly. And that's the other thing you have to worry about when trying to shoot at regiments is make sure they're not engaged and they're not kind of pulling that tactic on you where they're trying to get into engagement in order to prevent you from shooting at them. Because what I like to do is I'll kind of engage an enemy regiment and then try to move forward and engage another enemy regiment, so I'm kind of never being able to be a target of a volley action. At least that's my objective with some of my stronger regiments. The other cool thing about volleys is the throwing weapons. They have their 3-inch kind of volley, and they can actually volley when they're in melee. So that's kind of a little fun thing to be able to do. So pay attention to that when it comes to the Nords. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Resinator's Conquest podcast. Next week we're going to have a Raw episode, and then after that, I'm not sure what we're going to do, but I'll figure out something.